You remember what we said yesterday? That the best counselor is not the one who gives the best answers, but the one who asks the best questions. Asking questions is very, very important. Why? Why is it so important? Or putting it in other words, if you have your notes, you will see the purpose in point number 1. What is the purpose of asking questions? Remember that so far we have seen that it's important for the counselee to feel understood, number 1. Then we saw it was very important to feel listened, number 2. Now there is a third goal in counseling, which is to make the counselee think, reflect, evaluate, consider the situation, the problem, the question, whatever you may call it, from all the different possible angles. So the purpose of asking questions is to make you think, to make the counselee think. Usually, I use an illustration that the counselee understands quite well. Imagine this is the problem that the counselee brings to us. And I ask him, what do you read here? And he says, nothing. It's a blank paper. Nothing. And I say, no. I read, number 1, its purpose. Number 2, how it works. Number 3, its practice. Why? You see nothing. And I see that quite a number of things are written here. What's the obvious reason? He or she is looking at the paper from an angle, from a perspective that I am not, and the other way around. Our tendency, however, our natural tendency is to stick, to get fixed, anchored to just one perspective. So the purpose of the counselor is to help the counselee see the paper, the problem, the situation from all the different angles, all the possible angles. You see the mountain from the north, from the east, from the south, and from the west. So the art of asking questions is intended to help the counselee go around the problem and view it from all the different perspectives. To such an extent that by the end of the counseling process or by the end of the session, it is a very successful session if the counselee says, oh, I had not seen that before. You can feel very satisfied if this is what they say. I had not seen that before. I had not seen it this way. Now, this art of asking questions, whose purpose is making think, follows the learning or the therapy by insight. Probably you are acquainted with this technique, the insight technique. The word insight may sound very psychoanalytical and somehow complicated, but it's a very simple one. My eyes are now open. Now I come to see by myself. I realize I am aware. We have some striking examples in the New Testament of people, individuals whose eyes were opened. One of the most striking cases is the disciples of Emmaus, when they were walking along the road and they were talking to the risen Jesus, and all of a sudden, when they were praying by the table, the text says that their eyes were open. Now I see. Now I realize it. This is learning by insight, to discover by yourself. And this is a very fruitful kind of discovery and learning. And this is the basic tool in deep psychology, but it's a basic tool also in many forms of learning and teaching. Learning by insight. Incidentally, there are mainly three kinds of learning in life. In life, we learn mainly from three sources. We learn by obligation. You have to do that. Compulsory learning. It's an obligation. This is most of the learning that we do at school, at least in certain schools. Learning by obligation. Then there is second kind of learning, that is learning by imitation. You imitate, you copy. And it's exactly the opposite from obligation. In obligation, you feel you have to. In imitation, you want to, you like to, you are willing to be like the other person. I think it's a very good principle to remember, because in Christian life, a lot of the learning should be by imitation. We imitate. Paul used this expression, imitate me, as I am an imitator of Christ. The principle of learning by imitation follows the principle of identification. I identify with you. I like the way you are. I want to imitate you. Hence the importance of role models here. And the third way to learn is by insight. By insight. Now, I ask you a question. Which are the basic ways of learning in counseling? What percentage would you think, what importance should we give to each one of them? What percentage would you give to obligation or compulsory learning? Zero. Okay, 0. And then the two others are the main ones, okay? Because whether we realize it or not, whether we are aware or not, the counselee is learning from our behavior, from our way of being, from our lifestyle. I want to be like you. I like the way you speak. I like the way you listen. I like the way you treat people. I want to identify imitation, copying. This is a very important principle to remember. When we are counseling, we are sending messages which are non-verbal messages. And the counselee learns from our being too. From our being. I remember one patient once told me, I wish in my daily life I could be as punctual as you are. I try to be very punctual, and this is very unusual for medical doctors. At least in Spain, medical doctors make you wait for 30, 40 minutes, 1 hour. A medical doctor being punctual is a great testimony. And that's very simple. That's very simple. I'm just punctual. And they ask, how is it that you are so punctual? And the answer is, I care about you. I care about you. Your time is at least as important as mine. Your time is important too. So you are, with punctuality, you are conveying a message. The message that you are important. So, learning by insight and learning by identification are very important in counseling, in therapy in general. So we have to help the counselee discover the hidden dimension of the situation. And the questions should help discover the other side of the mountain. Questions, good questions, are like keys that open doors. Now, there is one question that you should try to avoid as much as possible. Notice that I'm trying to be very, very practical. There is one question that you should try to avoid as much as possible. Do you know what word this is? Why? Why? Most of the times, asking why is useless. And sometimes it is stupid. Because if the person knew why, he wouldn't be there in our office. Okay, the idea is just to give the option that for the counselee it's very important to understand the line, the process, the trajectory that led the person to that point. Every problem, every trauma, every situation has a past story, a way. It's like a travel with different stations. It's very important that we come to know the way that led that person to the situation. Getting to know the past story, as Richard said 2 or 3 days ago, is very important. And by sharing the life story, at the same time, the person, the counselee, will identify certain situations. Light, insight will come to their mind. They learned by telling. Asking the right questions is in itself, for the counselee, therapeutic. It is therapeutic. We experience this even in medicine. If you have some problem in, let's say, in your skin, and you don't know what it is, and you are afraid it is cancer, and you go to the dermatologist, and once the dermatologist has asked different questions, the mere fact that he has been interested in you and asking questions, even if he doesn't give you a diagnosis, helps you feel better. You have unburdened. So the mere fact of asking questions is in itself therapeutic. We close this by giving an example. Can you think of a Bible passage in the New Testament where Jesus gives a masterpiece of asking questions? John chapter 4, the Samaritan woman. It's fascinating to see the dialogue between Jesus and the Samaritan. And I would like to point out the 3 layers of communication which happen not only in counseling, they do happen in counseling, but in all human relationships. And we see them portrayed in this fascinating dialogue. There are 3 layers in the process of human communication. The first layer is simply an exchange of words. Give me water, please. Give me water. Now, usually the exchange of words is for courtesy, politeness. This is the most elementary level of communication, where your words are intended just for politeness. Your intention isn't to go deeper. This is the sort of conversation, perhaps we shouldn't use this word, but this is the sort of exchange of words that you have with someone you hardly know. Then, in John 4, we find the second layer, which is an exchange of ideas, talking about concepts, religion. Where do you think, Master, that we should worship? What is the right place for worship? This is a question related to religion. Okay? It's for information. Questions that have to do with information. And we can certainly spend hours at this layer talking about concepts, ideas that have nothing to do with our what?
Person.
With our heart, with our emotions, with ourselves. So there is a third layer, an exchange of words, exchange of ideas, which is an exchange of feelings, emotions. You open up your heart. You share your inner life. Go and call your husband. I have no husband. Go right to the core of the problem. Now, notice how Jesus is extremely careful and sensitive. And he follows a progressive deepening in the conversation, a smooth, a slow progress to reach the core of the problem. And Jesus follows in a wonderful way this three-layer process. Give me water. Then he answers the questions the woman had about religion, concepts. But finally, Jesus' idea was to help the woman change her life. This is why he took her into the emotional level. Now, it goes without saying that in counseling we need the third layer. It's impossible to do proper counseling. But sometimes the counselor tries to escape and tries to mask some situations which are hidden by intending to take us into the second layer. You should always avoid this. A counseling session is not a conversation between two friends who meet to discuss on philosophy or any other topic. This may sound strange to you, but it happens. I have found myself sometimes having to say, stop, let's not talk more about that, because some counselee are very, very what's the English word for that? They have a great capacity for leading you astray in the counseling process and not talking about the real problem. They mask their problem. And the purpose is to reach to the core of the problem. Go ask your husband. Now, that leads us to our final topic this morning. Growth, the ultimate goal of pastoral counseling. And now I think you do have your outline. Growth, the ultimate goal of pastoral counseling. There is a natural link with this Samaritan woman story. Go and call your husband. The ultimate goal in counseling is growth. The ultimate goal in humanist psychotherapies is to help the client feel better. Carl Rogers, Maslow, all the humanist psychologists, the goal is to make you feel better. The primary purpose of Christian counseling is not helping the counselee feel better, but become holier. The purpose is not to feel better, but to become holier. This is the summary of all that we're going to say in the next minutes. Of course, you will feel better when you unburden, when you share, but feeling better is the side effect, the consequence, not the primary purpose of the counseling. Feeling better is always a byproduct that occurs as a result of counseling, but not its end. I think we have to explain a little bit more. Growth in what sense? What sort of growth? Because secular psychologists also talk about growth. For example, the psychotherapy of Adler has to do with growth. Adler was the one who worked on the inferiority feeling, inferiority complex. We all feel weak, in a sense. Adler's starting point had to do with the biblical concept of weakness, and then we all need to become stronger. This was his basic idea. So growth for Adler is from weakness into strength. But in which ways are we to help our counselee to grow? What is the ultimate goal of growth? Growth into what?
Christlikeness.
Right. This is exactly the word I was expecting from you. Christlikeness. Could any one of you read Colossians 1:28 and 29? Colossians 1:28 and 29.
Him we proclaim, warning everyone and teaching everyone with...
Notice these two verbs. Notice these two verbs. Can you repeat the verbs?
Warning everyone.
Warning.
And teaching everyone.
Good. Go ahead.
With all wisdom, that we may present everyone mature in Christ.
What a great verse. I think this is the golden rule of the Christian counselor. The golden rule of the Christian counselor. Let's stop here and consider these texts carefully. Warn and teach. Warning and teaching. There is a double element here. There is the element of warning that has to do with, the word warning here is quite wide. It includes comforting, encouraging, exhorting, admonishing. All this is included in the word. So that includes making you feel better. It is included, as we will see later. But there is a second element, which is clearly, explicitly, teaching. Teaching. There is a teaching. It is our purpose as Christian counselors, help the person grow into Christ-likeness. And Christ-likeness is maturity, mature in Christ. Now, the word mature in the New Testament is a very interesting word. The word mature that you will find at least dozens of times in Paul's epistles is in Greek the word teleios, which at the same time means perfect and also complete. Perfect, complete, and mature. All these the word teleios may mean. So anytime in the New Testament you find the word perfect or mature, the idea is something that is being rounded up until it is finished, completed. For example, Philippians 1:6. The one who started the good work in you will continue it till it is teleios, complete, mature, perfect. Now the idea of perfect is not sinless, without sin, but it's round up, like a circle that is started, and we go like this, and it is little by little, till finally we round it up. Rounding up. This is complete, teleios. Now it's finished. When the circle is finished, round up, complete. Bring to completion. I think this is a very helpful idea because it explains what growth is and growth into maturity. Christ was sinless, we are not. He was complete, and he was a paradigm of maturity. Now, all this may sound a bit abstract, although we have certain models. I would like to consider now one of the most important things I have to tell you in these 4 sessions. What are the main indicators of maturity according to the New Testament? What is a mature person? How can we know, and we can check ourselves here too, how can we know that we are mature? I would say there are basically 4 great indicators of maturity. According to Christ's life and Christ's character. So the model I follow here is the person of Jesus. First of all, the first indicator of maturity is a right self-concept. A right self-concept. Notice that the only time that Jesus referred to himself as a model, learn from me, it was to refer to his being humble and gentle or meek. Learn from me that I am humble and meek or gentle. Self-concept. Why is self-concept so important? Because the way I consider myself will greatly determine the way I treat others, the way I react, and the way I behave. I will repeat these 3 things. How I view myself will greatly determine the way I treat others, relationships, the way what's the second one I said?
React.
The way I react, my control, as we will see, and the way I behave, behavior, my ethics. This is why an appropriate self-concept is the first indicator of maturity. And you can have problems here in the self-concept, both because it is too high or too low. This is why Paul said in Romans 12, everyone should have a sober, a proper, a right self-concept. Not too high, but neither too low. Too high is the embryo, the seed for the paranoid personality. The paranoid personality is the person who feels that he is the best and the others are a nothing. A paranoid personality has a wrong self-concept. Inflated ego, has an inflated ego. Whereas it is possible also to have a deflated ego, punctured ego, when you think of yourself less than you are. Learn from me that I'm humble and gentle. Humility and meekness are the backbone of our identity. And being humble and being meek or gentle are an evidence, an expression of strength, mental strength, because it is much more difficult to be humble than to be pride. To be pride comes naturally. To be humble requires effort, and the same with being gentle. So the first indicator of maturity, and that we should be working on in our counselee, is self-concept. Self-concept. Who do you think you are? And work on the wrong self-concept, inferiority or superiority, pride, etc. Now, second, we said that it will greatly determine the way we treat others, okay? The way we treat others. Therefore, the second evidence of maturity is the agape love. The presence of agape love. The capacity for self-giving. Self-giving is a paramount expression of maturity. The healthiest sign of maturity is the ability, the willingness to give yourself to others. No doubt, number one evidence of maturity. Selfishness is not only a moral problem, it is indeed a moral problem, but self-centeredness has also psychological dimensions that have to do with that self-centered behavior that seeks for your own interests alone, only. The ability for self-giving is an expression of maturity, and we find that wonderfully displayed in the life of Jesus. Remember, on Saturday in the plenary session, I said that we need to decenter from ourselves, the selfish triangle, you remember that? Decentering from ourselves, centering on others, and super-centering on God. Now here we are on the second step, centering on our neighbor. Armand Nicoli, a former professor of psychiatry in the Harvard University. Harvard University is the temple of psychiatry. It's a temple of many things, but psychiatry is certainly the DSM. Do you know what the DSM-4 or 5 are? Do you know what the DSM is? The Handbook for Classification of Mental Disorders. Okay, the DSM is worked out in Harvard, etc. The former professor of psychiatry in Harvard, Armand Nicoli, a fine Christian who has a book together with Dialogue. Someone has written a book, Dialogue between Nicoli and C.S. Lewis. That's an interesting book. I can't remember the author. Dialogues between Nicoli and C.S. Lewis. Armand Nicoli, former chairman of the University of Harvard Department of Psychiatry in the 80s, said, agape love is the expression of maturity in all relationships. It's the hallmark of maturity in all relationships. In other words, for the relationship to be mature, the evidence, the test of maturity is the presence or the absence, the amount of self-giving, self-love. I think it's an interesting remark. So agape love is not only something having to do with Christians. Agape love is also something that should be referred to non-Christians as well. The way we treat others, agape love, The third indicator of maturity is self-control. All that has to do with the control of our impulses. Self-control. Low tolerance to frustration is exactly the opposite of self-control. Childish tantrums, outbursts, explosive, intermittent explosions. Jesus is the perfect example of self-control to such an extent that he was called the Lamb of God. A lamb is able to self-control. Self-control. The opposite of self-control is low tolerance to frustration that gives place to many addictions. And this is not only a problem with your serotonin. Certainly serotonin has to do a lot with impulsiveness. But behind impulsive disorders, there isn't only a problem with your serotonin. There is a problem with your maturity, self-control. And I said 4 indicators, there are 5 actually. Okay? A sense of responsibility, commitment. Responsibility or commitment. I like to use the word commitment because it's more connected to the biblical idea of faithfulness. Commitment. Responsibility or commitment. And finally, patience. We saw something about that this morning. Patience, which is not only perseverance. Patience is perseverance, certainly. But the word patience in our modern languages refers to 2 Greek words in the New Testament. One is perseverance, hypomones, which is the word used in Hebrews 12, verse 2, for example. Let us run with perseverance, with patience. But patience is also endurance, long-suffering. The word macrothymia, greatness of a spirit, strength, what the psychologists call ego strength, in the good sense of the word, the ego strength, the ability to face tough, difficult circumstances with courage, being able to persevere with this. Now, notice that self-concept, agape love, self-control, responsibility, commitment, and patience were hallmarks in the life of Jesus. And these are the areas we should be working in patience, in a counselee. Now, one more word about growth. When you are dealing with a person in counseling, growth follows a certain dynamics that you should not forget. Growth should not be like this. Should not. Okay? Notice that if growth is like this, you are always at the same level. Today you improve, tomorrow you are the same, you improve, you are the same. Usually this kind of growth that we call fluctuating counseling, actually there is no growth at all, happens when counseling is based predominantly on feelings or emotions, and the goal is to feel better. When the goal is to feel better, there is no real progress. Glyn Harrison, in his book, The Ego Trip, a book that I recommend to you, The Ego Trip, by Glenn Harrison, the psychiatrist who spoke yesterday evening, who has written the book A Better Story, has written a book called The Ego Trip that has to do with self-esteem. And Glenn explains in his book a survey that a number of people went through a course, an intensive course to improve their self-esteem based on secular psychologists. And the amazing conclusion was that after the course, they felt worse. I remember Glenn explaining that with the biggest smile in his eyes. So that is why I also smile now. They felt worse. This is what happens when you focus the attention in feelings. The goal is not to feel better, but as we said, to become holier, more adult, more perfect, more mature. Now, there is a second possibility, which is this one, which is we call the Sputnik growth. Growth like a Sputnik. This is not realistic. You have to be suspicious of sudden, spectacular improvement. Sudden, spectacular improvement might be related more with fantasy than with reality. And sometimes they are, if I may complicate it a little bit, related to transference. The counselee wants to make the counselor happy, to please the counselor, and says, "Oh, I'm much better," because unconsciously wants to make the counselor happy. And then all of a sudden it goes down. Now, real progress, real growth works like this. This is what we call the spiral growth. This is not a joke, this is science, scientific. This is not just an anecdote. This concept comes from Jungian psychology, which has some helpful concepts. So you may think that this is just my easy joke or my easy anecdote. It is not. There is a combination of progress, and then all of a sudden you go backwards and down. But there is progress again, up we go. Notice the difference between this and this is that the point when you are down are not the same as in the beginning. You notice there is progress that you can measure. You cannot imagine how helpful this diagram is for clients, for patients. Extremely helpful. Time and again, patients express their gratitude for being able to understand that their growth is this way. And I think growth in Christian life and growth in counseling works exactly like this. Ups and downs, but we are not children anymore. We are not drinking milk anymore. We are making progress. It's very important that we evaluate our progress with these objective measures I wanted to give you this morning. I gave you these tools, the 5 indicators of maturity that correlate highly with the Holy Spirit. It's not something subjective, how I feel. I feel better, I feel so and so, but the objective reality.